The years between 1882 and 1892 changed everything about children in America. It was the peak of the orphan train movement. It was also the peak of the dime museum industry. Two systems operating out of New York City, both hungry for human bodies. One system claimed to rescue children from the streets. The other put children on display for paying audiences. Nobody has ever mapped them against each other. Between 1854 and 1929, roughly 250,000 children were loaded onto trains. They were shipped from New York to towns across the Midwest. They were called orphans, but that word was generous. Fewer than half of them had actually lost both parents. Many still had a mother or father living somewhere. As many as 25% came from intact families too poor to feed them. The Children's Aid Society and dozens of smaller organizations collected these children. They pulled them from streets, tenements, and poorhouses. They scrubbed them, dressed them in donated clothing, and sent them to rural towns across the Midwest. At each stop, the children were lined up and presented to crowds of prospective families. The boys were promoted as strong and handy. The girls were described as capable of housework. Townspeople inspected them the way you might inspect livestock at market. Then they chose. That is the part of this story that gets told. The rescue narrative, the charitable experiment, the precursor to modern foster care. And some of it is true. Some children found loving homes. 2 orphan train riders eventually became state governors, Andrew Burke of North Dakota and John Brady of Alaska. The system gave thousands of children a chance they never would have had otherwise. I acknowledge that fully. But there is another layer to this story, one that lives in the spaces between the records that exist and the records that should exist but do not. Because the record keeping in this system was catastrophic, not accidentally, structurally. There was no standardized system for documenting these children. Each organization kept its own records using its own methods. Many organizations did not communicate their statistics to one another. Children taken directly from the streets often had no family information gathered at all. Names were changed at intake, changed again at placement, sometimes changed a third time by the receiving family. Siblings were routinely separated, sent to different states, given different surnames. Birth dates were estimated or invented. Religious affiliations were reassigned. Catholic clergy accused the Protestant-led Children's Aid Society of deliberately placing Catholic immigrant children in Protestant homes. The Society for the Protection of Destitute Roman Catholic Children was founded in 1863 specifically in response to those accusations. The system was not merely chaotic, it was contested. The National Orphan Train Complex acknowledges that records regarding the numbers and names of children placed have been lost or destroyed. The New York Foundling Hospital sealed its records entirely. Families requesting information receive only non-identifying letters. No copies of original documents are provided. And the Foundling Hospital had a specific policy that made tracking even harder. They deliberately avoided formal adoption. Without legal adoption, the Foundling retained the right to remove children from placements. But that same legal ambiguity meant children could be moved, redirected, or reassigned without the legal protections that adoption would have provided. 2 million Americans alive today descend from orphan train riders. 1 in 25 people in this country has a connection to someone who passed through this system. And for a staggering number of those descendants, the family tree hits a dead end. Not because the records were lost in a fire or flood, because the system was designed to sever identity. Children were told to break all contact with their past. Alice Ayler, one of the last surviving riders, said it plainly in 1996. She was one of the luckier ones because she knew her heritage. The younger riders had their identities taken from them. Contact with their previous lives was forbidden. Now hold that thought, because I need you to understand what else was happening in the same city during the same years. The dime museum industry exploded in the 1880s. These were storefront entertainment halls, cheap admission, packed with exhibits. And the most popular exhibit, by far, was the human oddity. People with unusual bodies, unusual sizes, unusual proportions, displayed for paying audiences who came to stare. By the 1880s, dime museums were opening across America, but New York was the capital. The Bowery district alone had multiple competing museums, each trying to outdo the others with more spectacular human exhibits. By 1890, traveling circus sideshows had expanded from a handful of acts to 12 or 15 per tent. The appetite for human curiosities was enormous, and the industry paid well. Top performers earned hundreds of dollars per week. The economics were simple. If you could find someone unusual enough, you could make a fortune displaying them. And the industry recruited aggressively, especially among children. P.T. Barnum built his empire partly on child performers. General Tom Thumb was recruited as a small child from Bridgeport, Connecticut. Anna Swan was discovered in Nova Scotia at 15 and brought to Barnum's American Museum in Manhattan. Ella Ewing, the Missouri giantess, was approached by a Chicago museum agent named Louis Epstein, who traveled to her rural town, specifically after hearing rumors about her. She was offered $1,000 for a 27-day appearance. Her father initially refused. He considered it an affront to their Baptist values, but the money was more than he could earn in 5 years of hard-scrabble farming. He relented. Ella spent the next 17 years on the exhibition circuit. She was one of the fortunate ones. She had parents negotiating her contracts. She had a community that knew her name. Those are the ones with names. The ones with families who advocated for them. The ones whose stories survived because someone cared enough to preserve them. Robert Bogdan, a Syracuse University professor who spent decades studying the sideshow industry, made an observation that should trouble anyone familiar with this history. For a lot of the people in these acts, he said, there are no written records, just the pictures. Think about what that means. Hundreds of performers exhibited across America throughout the late 1800s, and for many of them, no one recorded where they came from. No birth records, no family connections, no origin stories beyond whatever fiction the promoter invented for the pitch card. Photographs were taken. Cartes de visite were sold by the thousands. Audiences paid to stare. But nobody wrote down who these people were before the stage name was assigned. They existed as exhibits, and before that they existed nowhere that documentation can reach. Here is where I need you to see the geography. The Children's Aid Society operated from Lower Manhattan. The New York Foundling Hospital operated from the Upper East Side. Barnum's American Museum sat on Lower Broadway. Charles Eiserman's photography studio, where the majority of known sideshow performer portraits were taken, operated from the Bowery. The Dime Museum district clustered around the same blocks. These institutions, the orphanages and the exhibition halls, existed within walking distance of each other. They operated in the same decades. They drew from the same population of vulnerable, undocumented, unprotected children in a city with 30,000 homeless minors on its streets. The sideshow industry had a documented history of sourcing performers from vulnerable populations. Enslaved children with physical differences were bought and sold specifically for exhibition value. Conjoined twins, Millie and Christina, were purchased from their enslaver for $30,000 in 1852 and exhibited as children. People in institutions, people without family advocacy, people whose absence would not be noticed or investigated. These were the bodies the industry consumed most easily. And just blocks away, a parallel system was processing thousands of children per year. It operated with minimal documentation. It changed their names, severed their identities, and sent them into a pipeline with gaps so large that the institutions themselves cannot account for where every child went. I sat with this research for 3 weeks before writing a single word. Not because the evidence was weak, because I could not figure out where the line was between what I could prove and what the evidence merely screamed at me without confirmation. No single document connects these two systems. No ledger entry says transferred to exhibition. No whistleblower came forward in 1890 to testify that children were being diverted from orphanage rolls into sideshow circuits. That document may not exist. It may have never existed. And that absence is the thing I cannot resolve. It is either proof that the connection never happened, or it is proof that it happened in exactly the way you would expect if no one wanted it documented. What I can prove is this. Both systems operated simultaneously. Both drew from the same unprotected population. Both changed children's names and severed their identities. Both had massive documentation gaps that persist to this day. One system had financial incentive to acquire unusual human bodies. The other system had no reliable mechanism for tracking where every child actually went. The sideshow industry peaked in the exact decade the orphan train system processed its highest volume, and performers who entered the exhibition circuit as children frequently had no verifiable origin story at all. The photographs from Eisenman's studio on the Bowery show face after face, body after body, each one marketed with a fabricated biography. The Ohio Fat Boy, the Circassian Beauty, the Young Prodigy. Names assigned by promoters to children whose real names were never recorded or were deliberately erased. These photographs were taken blocks from the orphanages. Children in this era were assessed for physical utility from the very first orphan train expedition. The agent on that 1854 trip to Michigan told prospective families the boys were handy and the girls could handle housework. Children were evaluated by what their bodies could do. Strong boys went to farms, healthy girls went to kitchens. But what about the ones whose bodies were different? The ones whose physical development was unusual, whose growth was atypical, whose proportions did not match what a farming family wanted. In a system with no centralized oversight and no accountability for individual outcomes, where did those children go? The official answer is nowhere specific. They were placed, or they were not placed, or they were transferred, or the records were lost. The institutions give the same response every time. We do not have complete records. Privacy laws prevent disclosure. The information is unavailable. But unavailable is not the same as non-existent. And incomplete is not the same as innocent. Consider the timeline one more time. The 1880s and 1890s were the peak years for orphan train volume. They were the peak years for dime museum attendance. They were the peak years for sideshow expansion. They were the peak years for carte visite photography of human oddities. And they were the years when the greatest number of children passed through institutions in New York City with the least amount of documentation and oversight. Every one of those facts is independently verified. Every one comes from mainstream historical sources. It is only when you lay them side by side that they become uncomfortable. There is a phrase I've been turning over for weeks now. The system was not built to remember. It was built to process. It moved children like raw material from one location to another. It changed their names so the old ones could not be traced. It sealed the records so the origins could not be recovered. It told children to forget where they came from and punished them for looking back. That is not carelessness. Carelessness loses some records. This system lost identities. You may have walked past evidence of this and never known it. If you have ever scrolled through old photographs of sideshow performers and wondered who they were before they had stage names, you have asked the right question. If you have ever hit a wall in your family tree around 1880 or 1890, you may be closer to this story than you think. 2 million Americans descend from orphan train riders. The ones we can trace are the success stories. The ones we cannot trace are the ones worth asking about. Ella Ewing had parents who loved her. She had a name. She had a hometown. She had a Baptist church. She had agency, even if the economics eventually pushed her onto the circuit. What about the children who had none of those things? The ones pulled from New York streets with no names recorded. The ones whose intake forms listed an estimated age and a physical description and nothing else. The ones who entered the system as numbers and exited as question marks. Where did they go? Who did they become? And why does every institution connected to this era respond to those questions with the same locked door? I cannot tell you with certainty that orphanages fed children into sideshows. I can tell you that the conditions for it were perfect. I can tell you that both industries thrived on the same raw material. I can tell you that one had supply and no accountability, while the other had demand and no scruples. I can tell you that the evidence trail goes dark in exactly the places where you would expect it to go dark if someone wanted it to. And I can tell you that the children at the center of this deserve better. The ones without names, without families, without advocates, without records. Those children deserve better than a locked archive and a form letter saying the information is unavailable. 250,000 children pass through this system. We know where some of them went. We celebrate those outcomes. But the ones who vanish between intake and placement, between the ledger and the train, between the institution and whatever came next, those children had faces once. They had names once. Someone knew them. And then the system made sure that nobody would know them again. The records that survive tell us about the children who made it to the other end of the line. They tell us nothing about the ones who did not. And until someone opens those archives, we are trusting institutions that lost track of children to tell us everything was fine. Until someone maps every intake against every outcome. Until someone accounts for every child who entered and never appeared on the other side. An estimated 2 million living Americans carry orphan train blood in their veins. That is not a historical footnote. That is a nation of people whose family stories begin with a gap, a silence, a line in a ledger that stops mid-sentence. The trains kept running for 75 years. The museums kept filling for the same 75 years. And somewhere in the blocks between the orphanage and the Bowery, children disappeared into a gap. 2 centuries of record keeping have never closed it. Their names are still in those sealed archives. The question is whether anyone will ever be allowed to read them.